When my sister betrayed me, rebuilding after she stole my husband and my life. Family. It's a bond that should be unbreakable, a connection that withstands the hardships of life. I always believed that, no matter the situation, family came first. So when my younger sister Claire found herself on the brink of homelessness, I didn't think twice about offering her a place to stay. Claire had been through a rough time. She lost her job, her long-term relationship had just ended, and she was in debt. She showed up on my doorstep, eyes swollen from crying, looking like she hadn't slept in days. I felt for her. Despite the strained relationship we'd had over the years, she was still my sister. I couldn't turn her away. My husband David wasn't thrilled about the idea. He was polite about it, but I could sense his hesitation. "Are you sure about this, Jenna?" he had asked one evening, sipping his coffee while leaning against the kitchen counter. "I just don't want her staying here long term. We've got our own life to manage." "I know," I had replied, brushing off his concerns. "It'll only be for a few weeks, maybe a month, just until she gets back on her feet." If only I had known how drastically those weeks would change everything. At first, things seemed fine. Claire was grateful and respectful. She kept to herself mostly, occasionally helping out with chores or watching our son Ethan when David and I were busy. She expressed so much gratitude that I felt guilty for the fleeting moments when I found her presence disruptive. But as time went on, the dynamic in the house began to shift. David grew distant, cold even. His usual affectionate gestures faded into mere formalities. At first, I thought it was stress from his demanding job. He was a financial analyst, often working late nights and weekends. I'd ask if everything was okay, but he always brushed it off. "Just work," he'd mutter. However, it wasn't just David who changed. Claire, too, began to act differently. She no longer seemed like the grateful, broken sister who had arrived on my doorstep. Instead, she grew more confident, almost too confident. She stopped offering to help with household chores and spent most of her time lounging around in my living room as though she owned the place. And then there were the late-night conversations between her and David. At first, I dismissed them as harmless. They were probably just talking about general things. But as the nights wore on, the quiet conversations were punctuated by hushed laughter and whispered words that felt too intimate. I would walk into the room and both would go silent, like they were hiding something. The discomfort gnawed at me, but I refused to let paranoia take over. I trusted my husband, and I wanted to believe that my sister wouldn't betray me. But soon, the signs became too obvious to ignore. Claire started making subtle digs at my relationship. She'd make offhand comments about David's dissatisfaction, saying things like, "If I had a husband like David, I'd make sure to keep him happy," with a smirk that I couldn't quite place. The tension in the house grew unbearable. David and I began arguing more often, mostly about insignificant things that seemed to explode into full-blown fights. Claire always stayed quiet during these moments, but I could sense her watching us, almost feeding off the chaos. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, a place where I once felt loved and safe. Then came the breaking point. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I came home early, eager to relax. The house was quiet, too quiet. I went to check on Ethan, who was sleeping soundly in his room, but as I made my way downstairs, I heard voices coming from the living room. It was Claire and David. They were arguing, but the conversation wasn't about household issues or work. It was personal, intimate. "I'm tired of hiding this," Claire hissed. "How long are we going to keep pretending?" "Keep your voice down," David shot back. "We'll figure this out." My heart stopped. For a moment I was frozen, unable to move or breathe. But then the anger and betrayal surged through me, and I marched into the room. "What exactly are we pretending about?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. They both turned to look at me, shock etched across their faces. David was the first to speak, but his words didn't matter. The guilty expression on his face said everything I needed to know. He admitted it. They had started an affair a few months after Claire moved in. She had seduced him, or at least that's what he claimed, though I knew better. It wasn't just her. He had made the choice to betray me, to lie to me for months while they carried on under my roof. I turned to Claire expecting an apology, some form of remorse, but instead she had the audacity to smirk. "You never appreciated him," she said with cold indifference. "You were always too busy with work, too caught up in your own life. Someone had to step in." I threw her out that night. I couldn't bear to look at her, knowing how thoroughly she had destroyed my life. David left the next morning. He didn't even fight for the house for Ethan. He just packed his bags and walked out. Within weeks, David and Claire were living together. They flaunted their relationship openly, and it was humiliating. The whispers among our mutual friends were unbearable. As if that wasn't enough, I soon discovered that Claire had not only stolen my husband, but she had also drained our joint bank account, everything I had saved for years. She took it all. I was left with nothing. No husband, no home, and no financial security. My world collapsed around me, and I fell into a deep depression. I didn't even know how to explain it to Ethan. How could I tell my son that his aunt had destroyed our family? For a while, I stayed in a dark place, barely able to function. But then something shifted inside me. I realized that sitting in my sorrow wasn't going to change anything. I needed to rebuild, for myself and for Ethan. So I fought. I got a lawyer, fought for custody of my son, and started rebuilding my life from the ground up. It wasn't easy. There were days when the pain of betrayal felt unbearable. But slowly, I found myself again. I found a small apartment, a new job, and started making new friends. I began to see that losing everything had forced me to discover strength I didn't know I had. And just when I thought I was finally free from the past, David showed up at my door. He looked terrible, disheveled and broken, a shell of the man I once knew. He told me Claire had left him too for someone wealthier. She had taken what little money he had left and disappeared. The desperation in his eyes was palpable. "I made a mistake, Jenna," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to come back. I want us to be a family again." But I had changed. The woman standing before him wasn't the same one who had pleaded with him months ago to stay. I had learned that some wounds don't heal, that some betrayals cut too deep. I looked at him, my heart surprisingly calm. "No, David, we're done." And as I closed the door on him, I realized I wasn't losing anything anymore. Instead, I had gained everything I truly needed, myself. When Jenna opened her home to her struggling sister Claire, she never imagined the betrayal that would follow. What began as an act of kindness quickly spiraled into a nightmare as Claire seduced Jenna's husband and destroyed her family. Left with nothing, Jenna is forced to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. But as she begins to rebuild, she discovers a strength she never knew she had, one that will lead her to reclaim her life, even as those who betrayed her come crawling back.